If you still believe that editing video well depends on spending hours cutting mistakes, silences, retakes, and manually moving things around on a timeline, then I need to tell you something very clearly. That process has already started to change, and it has not changed in a small way. It has changed in a way that affects not only editing itself, but the entire logic of content production. Today, I want to show you a shift that, in my view, is one of the most important for anyone who creates video consistently. The possibility of using natural language to turn a raw file into a much cleaner, much more dynamic, and much more publishable video. And the most interesting part is that this should not be seen only as automation for the sake of automation. It should be seen as a gain in operational intelligence, because in the end, the big question was never only how to edit faster. The big question is how to produce better with less friction, without losing creative control, and without being trapped in a process that drains too much energy. And this is exactly where this new combination of artificial intelligence editing tools, orchestration with Claude, and visual engines capable of turning instruction into execution becomes so important. A lot of people look at this and think only about a shortcut. I do not see it that way. I see it as a layer shift. Before, traditional editing almost always depended on a very manual workflow. You recorded, dropped the file into an editor, watched everything, cut mistake by mistake, removed filler words, adjusted pauses, organized pacing, decided every visual cue, and then rendered. That worked for a long time, and it still works, but there is a huge difference between something working and something still being the best way to operate. What is changing now is that editing is starting to leave the purely mechanical model and move into a model of interpretation. Instead of telling the machine exactly where to cut, you start telling it what result you want, and that changes everything. Because one thing is giving technical commands, another thing is saying something like this: take this raw video, remove the mistakes, cut unnecessary pauses, eliminate filler words, keep the pacing tighter, and then add visual elements at the moments when the speech needs reinforcement. When the tool starts understanding that kind of instruction, the video stops being just a file to edit and starts becoming a problem to solve. And I really like this shift because it brings video creation closer to something I have been repeating here on AI Core for a long time. The value is not only in the tool. The value is in how the tool enters a system. If I have a tool that only cuts video, great. If I have another one that only animates, that is also great. But when those tools start talking to each other inside one workflow, productivity stops being occasional and becomes structural. Let us think calmly about what that means. If I record a raw 50-second video full of pauses, hesitations, retakes, and small speech stumbles, the old process requires me to go in manually and clean everything up. But now I can drop that file into a workflow where one layer handles analysis, another handles transcription, another identifies the segments that deserve cutting, and another prepares the ground for visual elements synchronized to the speech. Do you understand how big that is? I am not talking only about saving time. I am talking about transforming a handcrafted process into something more architected. But here comes a point that I think is essential. That does not mean artificial intelligence does everything perfectly on its own. And anyone selling that fantasy is oversimplifying the reality. What actually happens is a partnership. The machine accelerates, interprets, proposes, organizes, and executes much of the heavy work. But there is still a human stage of direction. And to me, that stage is the most important one of all. Because editing video is not only about removing mistakes. Editing video is rhythm, it is retention, it is feeling, it is timing. It is deciding when a visual element should enter, when information needs reinforcement, and when a silence should stay or go. So when I hear someone say artificial intelligence is simply going to replace all editing, I think that reading is incomplete. What it is really doing is moving the human from the mechanical function to the strategic function. That is huge for creators. That is huge for small teams. That is huge for people who publish frequently. That is huge for people who want scale without losing quality. Because until recently, a lot of people were stuck in a bad equation. Either they recorded a lot and suffered to edit everything, or they edited well and could not sustain volume. Now that equation is starting to change, not because the work disappeared, but because the nature of the work changed. One of the clearest examples of this new phase is exactly the combination between an orchestration layer like Claude and specialized tools for specific stages of the pipeline. In this model, Claude is not the final visual editor. It works like an organizing brain. It understands the goal, accesses the projects, pulls the right resources, uses the right skills, talks to the tools, and starts building the workflow. That is very powerful, because it means you no longer need to think only about one isolated tool. You start thinking in terms of ecosystems. And when we talk about ecosystems, the conversation rises in level, because this is not just about editing today's video. It is about building an environment where your future videos become faster and better to produce. That point, to me, is one of the most underestimated of all. A lot of people get impressed by the first automatic edit. I get more impressed by what comes after. By the possibility of creating patterns, styles, visual philosophies, behavior libraries, and structures that make the next video stronger. Think about it. If you make a recurring type of video, like lessons, tutorials, commentary, analysis, or shorts, and you begin teaching the system to understand your style, then you are not only editing one video. You are training a logic. You are creating preference data. You are leaving useful traces for future executions, and that makes an enormous difference. It is like teaching someone to work with you. At first, you need to explain a lot. You need to be specific, correct things, guide, show what you liked and what you did not like. After some time, that person understands your taste, your rhythm, your standards, and your objective better. With artificial intelligence applied to editing, the logic is very similar. In the beginning, you say more. Later, you gain more. That is why I like the comparison of teaching a child to ride a bike. At first, you need to hold on, correct balance, and guide the direction. You do not throw a child onto a bike and expect instant perfection. With automated editing, the same thing happens. People who expect perfection on the first click almost always get frustrated. People who understand that this is really process building see much more value. Now, there is another technical point here that deserves to be understood in a simple way. For good editing with synchronized visual elements, it is not enough to only cut the video. You also need a very precise understanding of what was said and when it was said. In other words, transcription is not only for subtitles. It is also a temporal map. When a word or phrase is tied to an exact point in the timeline, you gain the ability to place motion graphics, cards, text, visual reinforcements, and animations exactly where they make sense. That may seem like a small detail, but it is not. It is the difference between a video that has graphics thrown in and a video where the elements actually feel connected to the speech. When that synchronization happens, the feeling of quality rises a lot. The viewer does not think in technical terms, of course, but they feel it. They feel when the video seems well built. They feel when the visuals reinforce the message instead of competing with it. And here we arrive at an interesting discussion about different visual tools. Not every animation engine delivers the same feeling. Some solve the functional side well, but still feel generic. Others deliver a more sophisticated finish, with more visual identity, more refinement, more elegance. That matters because as motion graphic generation improves, the difference becomes less about the fact that animation exists and more about the quality of the visual language itself. In other words, it is not enough to animate. You need to animate correctly. It is not enough to place a card. It needs to enter at the right moment, in the right form, at the right size, and without blocking the face, the readability, or the message. It is not enough to automate. You need to automate with intention. And I keep insisting on this because the temptation of this new phase is to use speed as an excuse to lower standards, and that is a mistake. If the technology is giving you more speed, then the goal should not be to create anything faster. The goal should be to create better with less operational effort. In practice, this leads to a much more interesting production model. You record a raw video. The artificial intelligence removes mistakes, silences, and repetitions. After that, you give visual direction about what should be reinforced. Something like this. When I talk about the pipeline, show a visual story of a raw file becoming an edited video. When I say mistakes will be cut, show a visual cut happening. When I compare one solution to another, make the difference in style appear through color, position, and animation. Do you see it? You are still directing, but you are no longer manually building every tiny detail by hand. To me, that is the best of both worlds. You do not lose identity, you do not lose vision, you do not lose decision-making. But you also do not continue doing manually everything that a machine can already accelerate. And there is an even deeper impact here, which is the impact on creative scale. When the burden of editing decreases, the creator gains mental margin. And mental margin is one of the most valuable things in the game. Because the biggest bottleneck for many people is not only technical, it is energetic. It is opening the editor already tired. It is knowing that hours of cuts, organization, refinement, and export still remain. When that load drops, more room appears for thinking about ideas, scripts, positioning, titles, retention, and strategy. I would even say this is the real shift. It is not only about editing faster, it is about moving the focus from the hand to the mind. Less energy spent on repetitive tasks, more energy used on decisions that actually increase value. That does not mean everything becomes simple. There are costs, there are tokens, there are tests, there are iterations, and that also needs to be understood with maturity. The more specific you are when guiding the tool, the lower the chance of waste. The better you plan the scenes, the more efficient the execution tends to be. So automation does not remove the need for clarity. It increases the importance of clarity. People who speak poorly to the AI receive mess in return. People who think poorly about the workflow receive rework in return. People who do not know what they want tend to spend more time, more limits, and more patience. But people who learn how to ask well, review well, and train the process step into a different level. And that is why I see this kind of end-to-end editing as more than a technological curiosity. I see it as a new way to operate video, a way where recording, transcription, cutting, visual reinforcement, rendering, and project organization can become parts of the same engine instead of separate islands. For me, that is the key knowledge worth taking from this subject. It is not about being dazzled because an AI cut a silence. It is about understanding that we are entering a phase where video begins to be produced by more intelligent systems. Systems that learn style, organize projects, synchronize speech with visuals, and reduce the weight of repetitive work. And that has a direct consequence for the future of the creator. Because the creator who keeps thinking only in terms of isolated tools may still manage to use one thing here and there. But the creator who starts building systems will gain much more. They will gain speed, they will gain consistency, they will gain internal references, they will gain style libraries, they will gain predictability. At the end of the day, what I want you to take from this video is the following. Artificial intelligence is not only arriving to cut mistakes from your video, it is arriving to reorganize the architecture of your production. And when that happens, the question stops being, how do I edit this file, and becomes, how do I build a workflow that gets better with every new video? That, to me, is the right question. Because when you start thinking that way, video stops being a heavy task that restarts from zero every single time, and it starts becoming an evolving process. Every project teaches something. Every iteration becomes learning. Every adjustment improves the next result. And suddenly, what looked like only a point of automation becomes a real operational advantage. I do not think this ends the role of the human editor. I do not think it makes visual sensitivity irrelevant. I do not think it replaces taste or experience, but I do think it changes the game deeply for the people who know how to use it. Because the advantage now is not only in knowing how to edit, it is in knowing how to build an environment where editing becomes less heavy and more intelligent over time. And for anyone who lives from video, that can represent a huge difference between staying trapped in operations or finally gaining the breathing room to create, publish, and grow with much more consistency. That is the change I see, and honestly, I think a lot of people are still underestimating how big it really is.